2024 saw a number of high-profile criminal and civil cases that all had one thing in common: the victim was a woman. We may have had an increase in media attention with the number of victims in cases waiving their rights to anonymity throughout the past year, but the fact of the matter is the issue of violence against women remains a significantly prevalent problem in Ireland. It is prevalent. Are we just hearing about it more, or is there an increase?
I think it's certainly the case that the prevalence is not decreasing by any metric that we have. We have lacked good data in relation to domestic and sexual violence historically, but in recent years we have had new reports both in Ireland through the CSO in terms of sexual violence. We have a new Eurostat Fundamental Rights Agency report on violence against women in Europe, and what that shows us is that in the context of just the work specifically Women's Aid do, which is around intimate partner abuse, is that 1 in 4 women will suffer some form of sexual abuse from a partner, and 35% of women are in Ireland experience either psychological, sexual or physical abuse from a partner.
Now, how the accuracy of this kind of statistic, it seems very high. 25% of all women suffer sexual violence or some sort of intimidation by their partner. That's 1 in 4. Look at a row of houses, and 1 in 4 of those houses inside is a woman who is being terrorised by her partner.
Yeah, and look, that CSO data is remarkably detailed. It was a years-long piece of work, and in fact our hope now is that there will be a repeat survey for Ireland conducted by the CSO on intimate partner abuse. It was very detailed. They released it in 4 separate tranches. So much information was involved. Unfortunately, I mean, we need to be clear that the definition of sexual abuse has a spectrum to it, and so it ranges from touching straight through to the act of rape. So everything is in that, and so it is of course important to look at definitions. However, we do also know from that Eurostat report that I mentioned that we have very high levels of reported sexual abuse across the board, not just from intimate partners, by Irish women and particularly younger women. So I think,
are we very different to the rest of Europe?
That data was released just at the end of November, and we're still looking at it. But in respect of intimate partner abuse, we are kind of in the comparative area, but the sexual abuse statistic appears to be higher, and so we'll be doing some work ourselves to look at understanding why that is. I do think at the same time, though, that we have been very silent and stigmatising of this issue for so many years, and there has been a definitive change in the public conversation, in the openness to discussing really important work in areas like consent have been trailblazing over only the last 10 years, and I do think that is encouraging people to speak out, including, as you mentioned, some of those who have waived their anonymity in criminal proceedings.
Now, in terms of your own work at the coalface in Women's Aid, what is it? In 2023, 2,600. But in the context of the entire female population, that's relatively small. So it suggests, although that number should not be high at all, it should be much lower than that, it suggests that most people aren't complaining.
Well, what I would say is Women's Aid is a national service. We run a national helpline, a high-risk support project, and a range of advocacy campaigning and awareness campaigns. Our national helpline, and I might just pause to share the number because this particular segment may bring things up for people, is 1-800-341-900. Our statistics reflect Women's Aid's direct work. We refer to our 30 plus colleagues in the local services and refuges around the country. We also refer to the rape crisis centres all around the country. Our data is just the Women's Aid data. Our colleagues across the country every day right now are meeting and hearing from survivors of both domestic and sexual violence. And we also know, which is again borne out by that Eurostat report, is that those who reach out to specialist services for support are just the tip of the iceberg. And that's why it is so important to have a community response and recognition of this.
Therefore, what I suggested to you, even though the numbers are higher than the numbers just contacting Women's Aid, there are many people who suffer in silence.
Absolutely. We, through our own research, have found that women of all ages, about 30% will tell nobody. And we also have research conducted specifically with younger people and younger women in particular. Again, about a third will tell nobody. And that is chilling. But what we do know is that if they do tell somebody, for younger people, it's more likely to be a peer. It may be a family member. It may even be an employer. And that's why measures such as having our paid domestic violence leave on a statutory basis here, that's why awareness campaigns, not just to raise awareness of support services that are available, and they are available, but also to raise awareness of what coercive control is, what consent is, are so important so that victim survivors feel confident to speak out. And we also know that they need to be invited to share, because it's terrifying, the idea that they may not be believed or that they may be stigmatised for something that was not their fault.
Now, in the main and the huge majority of cases, it's the perpetration of this violence by men on women. There are some women who also perpetrate, but they're so tiny they don't really form part of our discussion. But men should, in terms as perpetrators, what do we know about the attitudes of men?
Well, and certainly just to acknowledge that abuse can happen, towards men as well, and also in LGBT relationships. And again, the national helpline, our helpline, will signpost to the likes of the Men's Development Network, Male Advice Line, and other relevant support services. So again, just to say there should be support there for everybody. But we are talking specifically about a very gendered issue, very gendered crimes. It is male violence against women. What I would also say is the vast majority of violence against men is perpetrated by men. And so this work to end male violence against women is also the work to end male violence against men.
The stats about men, 70% believe women's issues are exaggerated, and 2 in 5 men hold what are called traditional views.
Yes, this refers,
like the place of the woman, etc.
So just to maybe give a little bit more precision, because that alarming 72% figure is among the 2 in 5 men in Ireland who would hold much more traditionalist views. This was a report that was produced by CORE, a partner of ours, looking at exploring masculinity and attitudes to masculinity, and it engaged with both male and female members in a nationally representative survey. But the men's responses in particular were of interest. 2 in 5 men hold what we would call those traditionalist views, where they would espouse the view that dominance is the most effective expression and most desirable expression of strength, that expressing vulnerability is a weakness, in complete contrast to the 3 in 5 men who would, be much more in tune to, equality, the fact that recognising that there's sexism and that women's issues are
And do we know where
important.
those attitudes in that 2 in 5, where those attitudes are coming from?
Well, what was most startling when we published that report in late November of last year was that the majority of that cohort holding those traditionalist views are younger men. And I do think that, that there is that connection to where young men, boys receive their media, their information, the perhaps outsized influence of online social media platforms and the algorithms within them, which we know from research conducted by DCU on boys engaging with TikTok and YouTube as 2 examples, is that they are actively dragged into spaces which amplify a sense of male alienation, which direct them towards more misogynistic views, more traditionally held views, which both inhibit equality in relationships, but also inhibit men and boys in exploring a much more authentic self, which is more emotionally connected, which gives them permission to, to value and to lean into being a young person, a young man, or even an older man, where strength is not where they're defined. External trappings like wealth or being the main breadwinner are not the primary concerns. And those are the concerns of those more traditionalist individuals. And unfortunately, that puts them in direct conflict with measures that might be more trying to explore equality, diversity, and just healthy, respectful relationships that are predicated on mutuality and negotiation, and rather than stereotypical, quite sexist roles.
If you go back in time, and I suspect girls were always probably better than the boys in the Leaving Cert, and that is for sure today. But in the past, women, who qualify well, they often came to a full stop when it came to careers, whether they lost a job opportunity because they were female or because when they started a family they had to interrupt a career. That is less and less so. And do we know whether there's huge resentment building up on the part of young fellas who see the girls getting what they academically deserve.
I think it's really interesting, and when you look objectively at the kind of the status of equality and gender equality in particular across all metrics, we still have a gender unequal society. We are still 95th in the world in respect of our political representation of, say, women in public life. At board level, there is great work being done on gender pay gaps, but they still exist. And we also have huge structural issues that are inherited, which are sexist and patriarchal, where the burden of care work, for example, is very disproportionately held by women. So that is the reality. The glass ceiling is still, to a certain extent, in place. The structures and systems that facilitate women's participation in public life, including fair distribution of care, are still significant issues. But there does appear to be a perception on the part of a cohort of men, but particularly young men, that somehow equality has become tilted the other way. It isn't borne out by fact, but the feeling is clearly there. And I do think that a lot of work has been done to encourage measures around equality and girls and women to reach and stretch into, all of the potential that they have. But we maybe haven't given a message for young boys around why that is also good for them and the fact that they shouldn't be threatened by it.
Joe makes the point, traditional views, that's a shocking way of describing it. Traditionally, most men are very good people. Saying bad men have traditional views is disgusting, and it's the wrong term for it. But it tends to be the term that's being used, say, in America at the moment, for those who would have rather misogynistic views of women. I
actually choose the word traditional quite carefully for the reason that I don't think we should be entering into a binary that is about individual good or bad. We are socialised into a very historically, from time immemorial, quite sexist society. That is a fact, and it is clear. But traditionalist views are the ones that are the historical ones. If I used an alternative term such as toxic masculinity or something like that, I think that is not a helpful term. So I'm quite deliberately trying to suggest that we have structures and systems here, and we have culture and discourse that needs to support men to be their authentic selves, and not to feel threatened by the fact that women are still not at equality, but that we do, an equal society serves us all better.
The question for many women who are in terrible situations, they often weigh up, and it's a balance. If I walk out of here with my kids and go to a refuge, look for help from Women's Aid or whoever it might be, I lose my home. And it's an equation that they actually put their own suffering on hold and put up with it for what they perceive to be the greater good of the family.
Yeah, when we're talking about intimate partner abuse in particular, it is not straightforward. And we strongly encourage people never to kind of start framing the question as why doesn't she leave, but what is keeping her in that situation. And the responsibility in that situation is always on the perpetrator of the abuse. We become very focused on what a victim survivor can do, whereas actually the perpetrator could stop the behaviour. So that's something that we really need to pay attention to. And if you have the complicated situation of an emotionally complex relationship, one where there was love, there was, expectations of, a life together, where there is gaslighting, where there are children in common, where there are financials in common, it isn't straightforward. And that's why we need a multifaceted whole of government response, which is part of the third national strategy, which is at its midpoint. And so now with the formation of government, given that domestic violence is probably the highest call-out issue for An Garda Síochána, that sexual violence and domestic violence permeates all of our communities and has lifelong devastating impacts, including loss of life, we really hope that when it's published at 3:00 today, that we see some focus on a continued prioritisation of combating and preventing domestic and sexual violence in our programme for government.